Margaret Sullivan Hayes froze mid-step on the cracked sidewalk, her morning coffee tumbling from weathered hands as she stared at the impossible sight before her. The German shepherd sat in perfect military attention, her scarred muzzle pointing skyward in what could only be described as a salute. But it wasn't the disciplined posture that stopped Margaret's heart cold. It was the desperate intelligence burning in those amber eyes and the way 6 tiny puppies mewled weakly from a rain-soaked cardboard box at her feet. This wasn't just any stray dog begging for scraps. The tan lines around the shepherd's neck told of a recently removed collar, and those precise scars along her jaw whispered of specialized muzzle training that Margaret recognized from her decades nursing traumatized soldiers. "Sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, her voice catching as the dog's gaze locked onto hers with an urgency that transcended species. The shepherd's tail gave one sharp wag, a signal, not a greeting, before her ears swiveled toward the approaching footsteps of someone she clearly didn't want to see. What was this trained warrior protecting her babies from? And why did Margaret suddenly feel like she'd stumbled into a war that had never truly ended? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Valley's quiet streets as Margaret Sullivan Hayes wrapped her late husband's army jacket tighter around her shoulders. At 67, she'd grown accustomed to the hollow echo of her footsteps in the 4-bedroom house that once rang with children's laughter and James's booming voice. 3 years since the heart attack took him, and she still set 2 coffee cups out of habit. "Lord have mercy," she whispered to herself, a phrase that had become her morning prayer since the loneliness settled in like an unwelcome house guest. Social Security barely covered the mortgage on their dream home, forcing impossible choices between her heart medication and the heating bill. The pharmacy technician's pitying smile when she asked to split prescriptions into smaller, affordable portions had become a monthly humiliation. Margaret's daily walks through downtown Spokane served as both exercise and escape from the oppressive silence of empty rooms. The route took her past the old VFW hall where James had spent countless evenings with his Vietnam buddies, sharing stories she was never quite privy to. Some secrets, he'd say, were better left in the jungle. As an Army nurse during the war's final years, Margaret understood trauma's many faces. She'd held dying boys who called for their mothers, witnessed strong men reduced to trembling shadows by memories they couldn't outrun. That experience had made her marriage to Captain James Hayes both a blessing and a burden. She could read his nightmares in the tension of his shoulders, taste his guilt in the silence that followed phone calls from old unit members. The Pine Valley neighborhood had once been filled with military families, but gentrification was slowly pushing out the veterans on fixed incomes. Margaret watched helplessly as for sale signs sprouted like weeds in her neighbors' yards, each departure leaving her more isolated. The young families moving in were polite but distant, their children shuttled between soccer practice and piano lessons, while Margaret's own grandchildren lived 3 states away, visiting only on obligatory holidays. Her morning walks had become a lifeline, a reason to dress properly and venture beyond the walls that seemed to shrink a little more each day. She'd nod to familiar faces, the mailman who remembered James, the shopkeeper who still asked after her health, but real conversation had become as rare as her husband's presence. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd spent 40 years caring for others, first as a nurse, then as a military wife supporting James through his demons, and now found herself desperately needing the same compassion she'd freely given. Her children meant well with their weekly phone calls, but their lives in distant cities left little room for understanding the depth of her isolation. "I used to cook for 6, now I barely cook for 1, she'd confided to the parish priest last month, the admission scraping her throat raw. Father Murphy had nodded knowingly. but his platitudes about God's plan felt hollow against the ache of purposelessness that followed her like a shadow. This morning's encounter with the mysterious German shepherd had awakened something Margaret thought she'd lost forever. The fierce, protective instinct that had once defined her very existence. Margaret's hands trembled as she knelt beside the cardboard box, her nurse's training overriding 40 years of retirement rust. The 6 puppies couldn't be more than a week old, their eyes still sealed shut, tiny bodies shivering against the September morning chill. Their mother, the German shepherd who'd somehow commanded her attention with that impossible salute, watched every movement with the intensity of a sentry on guard duty. "Easy, girl," Margaret whispered, extending her hand palm up the way James had taught her with the stray dogs that wandered onto their property. "I'm not going to hurt your babies." The shepherd's nostrils flared, analyzing Margaret's scent with professional thoroughness. Something in her assessment must have passed muster because her rigid posture softened slightly, though her amber eyes never left Margaret's face. This wasn't the desperate gratitude of a starving stray. This was calculated trust, the kind that came from military training. Margaret had seen that look before in the eyes of wounded soldiers who'd learned to evaluate every medic, nurse, and orderly for signs of competence or threat. This dog was making the same assessment. "You're not just any stray, are you?" Margaret murmured, noting the precise way the shepherd positioned herself to maintain visual contact with both the puppies and the approaching morning foot traffic. "Someone trained you well, didn't they, sweetheart?" The shepherd's ears twitched at the endearment, but she maintained her protective stance. Margaret slowly reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the protein bar she'd packed for her walk, a luxury she could barely afford, but justified as necessary fuel for her daily exercise. Breaking off small pieces, she scattered them within the dog's reach. The shepherd's discipline cracked just enough to reveal desperate hunger. She devoured the offering in quick, efficient bites, never taking her eyes off Margaret or the puppies. Even starving, she ate with military precision, no wasted motion, no loss of situational awareness. "When did you last eat a real meal?" Margaret asked, her heart breaking at the visible ribs beneath the dog's still beautiful coat. German shepherds were magnificent animals. James had always preferred them to the labs their neighbors favored. This one would have been stunning in her prime, all black and tan majesty with intelligent eyes that seemed to hold conversations. As Margaret observed her, details emerged that suggested a story far more complex than simple abandonment. The dog's nails were recently trimmed, her teeth professionally cleaned despite her obvious malnourishment. Most telling were the tan lines around her neck, where a collar had been removed, not lost, but deliberately taken off. "Someone wanted you to disappear, didn't they?" Margaret's voice carried the weight of recognition. She'd seen this pattern before in the wives of soldiers who came home changed, men who sometimes made their families disappear from their lives rather than face the demons following them home from war. The shepherd's reaction to that observation was immediate and unmistakable, a quick dip of her head that looked disturbingly like a nod. Margaret's blood chilled. In 47 years of marriage to a career soldier, she'd learned to read between the lines of military speak, to recognize when official stories didn't align with the truth her husband carried in his nightmares. This dog's abandonment had the fingerprints of a cover-up. The sound of approaching footsteps made the shepherd's entire body tense. A jogger rounded the corner, earbuds in, focused on his morning run. The dog immediately shifted position, placing herself between the stranger and her puppies, but she didn't bark or growl. Instead, she watched with the controlled alertness of a trained security asset. Margaret found herself studying the jogger through the dog's eyes. Young, civilian, no threat assessment necessary. The shepherd's relaxation once he passed confirmed Margaret's growing suspicion that this animal had been trained to evaluate human threats with military precision. "You were somebody's partner, weren't you?" Margaret asked softly. A working dog. That's why you know how to read people. The shepherd's response was to carefully pick up one of her puppies and place it closer to Margaret, a gesture of trust that brought tears to the older woman's eyes. The tiny creature mewed softly, its pink nose searching blindly for warmth and sustenance. Margaret's practical nursing mind catalogued the puppy's condition. Underweight, but not critical. Cold, but responsive. Hungry, but not yet failing to thrive. They had perhaps 48 hours before malnutrition became life-threatening. Their mother was giving everything she had to keep them alive, literally sacrificing her own body to produce what little milk she could manage. "We need to get you all to safety," Margaret murmured, already calculating the cost of emergency veterinary care against her meager savings. The smart thing would be to call animal control, let the professionals handle the situation. But something in the shepherd's eyes suggested that official channels might not be safe for this particular family. The dog seemed to read her internal debate. With deliberate precision, she picked up each puppy and arranged them in a neat line within the cardboard box, a presentation that looked almost like a military inspection. Then she sat at attention beside them, her gaze fixed on Margaret with an intensity that felt like a direct plea. "You're asking me to take responsibility for them," Margaret realized aloud. "Not just to call someone else, but to personally guarantee their safety." The shepherd's tail moved once, not a wag, but a single deliberate sweep that carried the weight of confirmation. Margaret looked at the deteriorating cardboard box, at the 6 vulnerable lives depending on their mother's protection, at the intelligent animal who had somehow recognized her as potential salvation. Her fixed income, her heart condition, her isolation, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the immediate need before her. "All right, sweetheart," she said, decision crystallizing with the kind of clarity that had served her well in military field hospitals. "Let's get your baby somewhere warm. But we're doing this my way, and that means you're going to have to trust me completely." The shepherd's response was immediate and unmistakable. She stood and walked to Margaret's side, pressing her warm flank against the older woman's leg in a gesture of absolute faith. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen ran her hands along the German shepherd's flanks with professional thoroughness. Margaret sat in the plastic chair beside the examination table, one hand resting protectively on the carrier containing the 6 puppies, the other stroking the mother dog's head in gentle reassurance. "She's malnourished, but surprisingly healthy considering her condition," Dr. Chen observed, her fingers probing along the dog's neck. "These scars along her muzzle are interesting, very precise, almost surgical. And this—" She paused, her expression shifting from routine examination to puzzled concentration. "Margaret, I'm feeling something unusual under her skin. It feels like a microchip, but it's larger than standard pet identification." Margaret's stomach tightened. "What kind of microchip?" "I'll need to scan it to be certain, but the placement and size suggest it might be military grade." Dr. Chen reached for her scanner, a device that looked like a small handheld wand. "Military working dogs receive specialized chips that contain more information than civilian pets: health records, training certifications, handler assignments." The scanner beeped as it passed over the dog's shoulder, and Dr. Chen's eyes widened as she read the display. "Oh my God. Margaret, this isn't just any military dog. According to this chip, her designation is MWD Bella, service number K92847. She's classified as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, and her status shows—" Dr. Chen's voice trailed off as she scrolled through the information. "This can't be right." "What does it say?" Margaret's voice carried the steel of a woman who'd heard too many incomplete medical reports over the years. "It says she was retired from active duty 6 months ago and transferred to a civilian handler for permanent adoption. The handler listed is Dr. Chen looked up from the scanner with obvious confusion. Colonel Frank Morrison here in Spokane. But Margaret, if she was successfully placed with a loving retirement home, what is she doing on the streets with newborn puppies? Margaret felt the pieces of a disturbing puzzle beginning to align. Could you print that information for me? All of it? I can print the basic details, but some of this data is classified above my clearance level. Dr. Chen moved to her computer terminal. Margaret, whatever happened to this dog? It wasn't a simple case of getting lost or running away. Military working dogs are incredibly valuable assets. The Army doesn't just lose track of them. Bella, as Margaret now knew to call her, had remained perfectly still throughout the examination. But at the mention of Colonel Morrison's name, her entire body went rigid. A low rumble emanated from deep in her chest. Not quite a growl, but a sound of unmistakable distress. She doesn't like hearing that name, Margaret observed, her hand automatically moving to comfort the agitated animal. Easy, girl. You're safe now. Dr. Chen printed the information sheet and handed it to Margaret. The address for Colonel Morrison is in the system, Pine Ridge Subdivision, about 10 minutes from where you found her. Maybe he's been looking for her. Margaret studied the printout, her trained eye catching details that painted a troubling picture. Dr. Chen, this shows Bella was retired due to behavioral issues and transferred to Morrison 6 months ago. But look at her condition. This isn't 6 months of neglect. This is recent starvation, probably no more than 2 or 3 weeks, and these puppies are barely a week old. You're right. Dr. Chen frowned at her own records. The timeline doesn't make sense. If she's been with a loving handler for 6 months, she should be healthy and well cared for. Instead, she looks like she's been abandoned just long enough to become desperate. The veterinarian's words hung in the air as both women contemplated the implications. Margaret had seen enough cover-ups in her nursing career to recognize the signs: official stories that didn't align with physical evidence, records that raised more questions than they answered. I need to contact Colonel Morrison, Margaret decided, though every instinct screamed against involving the man whose name had triggered such fear in Bella. As her legal handler, he has a right to know she's been found. Dr. Chen nodded, but her expression remained troubled. I'll need to report the chip scan to the military database as well. It's required protocol when we encounter active or retired military working dogs. But Margaret, she hesitated, clearly wrestling with professional obligations versus growing suspicions. Maybe you should wait to contact Morrison until after we've stabilized Bella and the puppies. Give yourself time to understand the full situation. Margaret appreciated the veterinarian's diplomatic way of suggesting caution. How long do you think that might take? At least 48 hours. The puppies need round-the-clock monitoring, and Bella needs nutritional rehabilitation before she can produce adequate milk. I'd recommend keeping them here for observation. Dr. Chen's tone grew gentler. I know the cost is probably a concern, but we have a fund for situations like this. Good Samaritans who rescue animals shouldn't be financially penalized for their compassion. I can't accept charity, Margaret began automatically, the pride of her generation refusing handouts even in dire circumstances. It's not charity, Dr. Chen interrupted firmly. It's community investment. This dog served our country, and now our community has a chance to serve her. Besides, she added with a knowing smile, something tells me this story isn't over yet. Bella might need advocates more than she needs a comfortable retirement. As if summoned by her name, Bella lifted her head and fixed Margaret with that intense amber gaze. The look held communication that transcended species barriers, a plea for protection that went beyond simple physical care. Margaret made her decision with the same decisive clarity that had guided her through battlefield triage situations. We'll stay with them tonight. I want to monitor their progress personally. I was hoping you'd say that, Dr. Chen admitted. Bella hasn't let anyone else approach the puppies, but she trusts you completely. That kind of bond doesn't happen by accident, Margaret. This dog chose you for a reason. As if to emphasize the point, Bella carefully stood and moved to Margaret's side, pressing her warm flank against the older woman's leg in the same gesture of trust she'd offered on the sidewalk that morning. The contact sent warmth through Margaret's body, filling the cold spaces that loneliness had carved in her heart. "Tomorrow I'll contact Colonel Morrison," Margaret decided aloud, "but tonight we focus on getting this family healthy and safe." Dr. Chen began preparing a comfortable area in the clinic's recovery room, but Margaret caught her arm. "Sarah, if Morrison asks how we found Bella, I think we should keep the details vague for now. Something about this whole situation doesn't feel right." The veterinarian nodded grimly. "My thoughts exactly. In my experience, when official records don't match physical evidence, there's usually a story someone doesn't want told." Margaret looked down at Bella, whose intelligent eyes seemed to hold secrets that would challenge everything she thought she understood about honor, duty, and the cost of keeping dangerous truths buried. Margaret's hands shook slightly as she dialed the number listed on Colonel Morrison's information sheet. 3 days had passed since finding Bella, and the German Shepherd's recovery had been remarkable, almost suspiciously so. Her weight had stabilized, her coat was regaining its luster, and the puppies were thriving under Dr. Chen's expert care. But Bella's behavior told a different story entirely. Every time someone in uniform entered the clinic, the dog would position herself protectively between the stranger and her puppies, her amber eyes tracking their movements with the vigilance of a sentry on hostile watch. When the local police officer stopped by to check on their progress, Bella's entire body had gone rigid, a barely audible whine escaping her throat, not fear, but recognition of authority that had failed her before. "Colonel Morrison speaking?" The voice that answered was crisp, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable cadence of a career military officer accustomed to immediate respect. "Colonel Morrison, my name is Margaret Sullivan Hayes. I'm calling about a German Shepherd I found, Bella, service number K92847. According to her microchip, you're listed as her handler." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Margaret wondered if the call had dropped. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried carefully controlled emotion. "Mrs. Hayes, you can't imagine what a relief this is. Bella escaped from my property 2 weeks ago, and I've been searching everywhere for her. Is she all right?" Margaret frowned. 2 weeks didn't align with Bella's physical condition when she'd found her. "She's recovering well, Colonel. She was quite malnourished when I discovered her, and she has 6 newborn puppies with her." "Puppies?" Morrison's surprise sounded genuine. "I had no idea she was pregnant. The poor thing must have been terrified, hiding somewhere unsafe to give birth. Where did you find her?" "Downtown Spokane, near the old VFW hall." Margaret watched Bella through the clinic's window as she spoke. The dog was lying contentedly with her puppies, but her ears were alert, swiveling toward sounds beyond human hearing. "Colonel, I have to ask, the timeline seems unusual. Bella's condition suggests she's been without proper care for several weeks, not just 2. Another pause. "Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but Bella has always been challenging. She suffers from what we might call canine PTSD from her deployments. Sometimes she becomes agitated and refuses to eat for days at a time. I've been working with veterinary behaviorists, but progress has been slow." Margaret's nursing instincts prickled. The explanation was plausible but felt rehearsed, like a story polished through repetition. "I see. Well, she's at Spokane Valley Veterinary Clinic receiving excellent care. Dr. Chen has been wonderful with her." "Dr. Chen?" Morrison's tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not familiar with that practice. Mrs. Hayes, I'd prefer to have Bella treated by the veterinarians at the base who understand her specific needs. If you could give me the clinic's address, I'll arrange to pick her up today." Something in his urgency set off alarm bells in Margaret's mind. "Colonel, the puppies are still quite young, and Dr. Chen feels it would be dangerous to move them for at least another week. Bella has been through tremendous stress, and separating her from her litter prematurely could cause serious behavioral setbacks." "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison's voice carried the weight of command authority, "I appreciate everything you've done, but Bella is my responsibility. I know how to handle her needs better than civilian veterinarians." Margaret felt Bella's story pulling her deeper into waters she didn't fully understand. "Of course, Colonel, but as someone who's grown quite attached to this little family, I hope you don't mind if I ask, how exactly did Bella escape from your property?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. There was construction work being done on my fence. I believe she squeezed through a gap that I hadn't noticed. These working dogs are incredibly resourceful when they want to be." Margaret made notes on the back of an envelope as they spoke, her handwriting reflecting growing skepticism. That must have been quite a gap for a German Shepherd her size. And she traveled quite a distance. Your address in Pine Ridge is nearly 8 miles from where I found her. Military working dogs are trained for endurance, Mrs. Hayes. 8 miles would be nothing for Bella. Morrison's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Now, if you could please give me that address, I'll come collect her immediately. Actually, Colonel, I was wondering if I might visit you first, to see Bella's home, understand her environment. As someone who's become invested in her welfare, I'd feel better knowing she's returning to a safe, comfortable situation." The silence stretched so long that Margaret wondered if Morrison had hung up. When he finally responded, his tone had shifted to something approaching hostility. "Mrs. Hayes, while I appreciate your concern, Bella's living arrangements are not subject to civilian inspection. She's my dog, and I'll thank you to remember that." The mask was slipping, revealing something harder underneath the polished military courtesy. Margaret pressed on, guided by instincts honed through decades of reading between the lines of official explanations. "Of course, Colonel. It's just that my late husband was also career Army, Captain James Hayes. He always said that the bond between a soldier and his working dog was sacred, that you'd do anything to protect your partner." "James Hayes." Morrison's voice went very quiet. "Your husband was James Hayes?" Margaret felt the conversation shift into dangerous territory. "You knew him?" Our paths crossed during my service. Vietnam era. James was a good man." Morrison's tone had become carefully neutral, but Margaret detected something underneath. Recognition, perhaps even wariness. "He often spoke about his fellow officers with great respect," Margaret said, testing the waters, "especially those who served with distinction in difficult circumstances." "Vietnam was a long time ago, Mrs. Hayes. We all did what we thought was right at the time." Morrison's words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Sometimes the past is better left undisturbed. Margaret felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Colonel, did you know that Bella shows signs of extreme distress around certain military personnel? Dr. Chen noticed that she becomes agitated when men in uniform approach her kennel. As I mentioned, she has behavioral issues related to her service trauma. It's not uncommon for retired working dogs to develop trust problems." Morrison's explanation came too quickly, too smoothly. "Mrs. Hayes, I really must insist that you give me the clinic's location. Bella belongs with someone who understands her history." "Her history," Margaret repeated the word slowly. "Colonel, what exactly did Bella do during her deployments? Her records show EOD work, but there seem to be gaps in her service timeline." Morrison's sharp intake of breath was audible across the phone line. "Mrs. Hayes, Some aspects of military working dog operations remain classified. I'm not at liberty to discuss the details of Bella's assignments. Margaret made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. Colonel, I think there's been a misunderstanding about my intentions. I'm not trying to keep Bella from you. I'm trying to understand why a decorated military working dog with a loving handler would end up starving on the streets with newborn puppies. What exactly are you implying? Morrison's voice had gone dangerously cold. I'm not implying anything, Colonel. I'm stating facts. Bella's condition when I found her doesn't match your timeline. Her behavior suggests trauma beyond normal deployment stress. And frankly, your urgency to retrieve her without concern for her puppy's welfare seems inconsistent with the devotion you claim to have for her. The line went completely silent. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet, aware that she'd crossed some invisible line in the sand. When Morrison finally spoke, his words carried the chill of absolute authority. Mrs. Hayes, I suggest you be very careful about the accusations you're making. Bella is military property, and interfering with the lawful return of government assets can have serious legal consequences. I'll expect your cooperation in returning her immediately. Margaret felt a familiar surge of the courage that had sustained her through battlefield hospitals and military wife challenges. Colonel Morrison, Bella may be military property, but those puppies are civilians. And as the person who rescued them, I have a legal and moral obligation to ensure their welfare. I won't be intimidated into abandoning animals who've been placed in my care. This conversation is over, Mrs. Hayes. You'll be hearing from military police within the hour. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone with growing certainty that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple case of lost pets. She immediately dialed Dr. Chen's number. Sarah, it's Margaret. I just spoke with Colonel Morrison, and I think we're in trouble. He's threatening to send military police to collect Bella, and something about his story doesn't add up. What did he say that concerns you? Margaret quickly summarized the conversation, noting Morrison's evasiveness about Bella's escape, his knowledge of her late husband, and his aggressive response to her questions. Sarah, I think Bella didn't escape. I think she was abandoned, and Morrison's connection to James suggests this might be related to something from the Vietnam era. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, I've been doing some research since our last conversation. Military working dogs who develop behavioral issues are typically either retrained or, in severe cases, euthanized. They're not usually placed in civilian homes unless they're genuinely suitable for retirement. What are you saying? I'm saying that if Bella was exhibiting the kind of severe trauma responses Morrison described, military protocol would have been to keep her in a controlled environment with specialized handlers. Transferring her to a single civilian handler doesn't follow standard procedure. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of the situation. So, Morrison's story about her retirement placement might be a cover for something else entirely. Margaret, I think you need to document everything about Bella's condition when you found her. Take photographs, write detailed notes about her behavior, her physical state, the location where she was discovered. If this becomes a legal battle, you'll need evidence. Through the clinic window, Margaret watched Bella nursing her puppies with the devoted attention of a mother who'd sacrificed everything for their survival. The dog's amber eyes met hers through the glass, and Margaret saw something that made her decision easy. Sarah, I'm not giving her back to Morrison, not until I understand what really happened to her. That's a dangerous position to take against a military officer, Margaret. I've been in dangerous positions before. Besides, Margaret's voice carried the steel of absolute conviction, James always taught me that sometimes doing the right thing means standing up to authority, even when it's costly. As she hung up the phone, Margaret realized that her quiet retirement had just collided with a past she'd never fully understood, and that Bella's secret might be the key to finally learning the truth about the shadows that had followed her husband home from war. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she heard the military jeep pull into the veterinary clinic's parking lot. Through the window, she watched two men in army uniforms step out. One young MP with the rigid posture of someone following orders, the other an older man whose bearing screamed command authority even from a distance. Colonel Morrison had arrived faster than promised, and he hadn't come alone. Bella's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The German shepherd shot to her feet, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from deep in her chest as she positioned herself between her puppies and the approaching footsteps. Her amber eyes had gone wild, pupils dilated with what Margaret recognized as pure panic. This wasn't the controlled alertness she'd shown around other uniformed personnel. This was raw, primal terror. "Easy, girl," Margaret whispered, but her own voice shook with growing dread. "I won't let them hurt you, Doctor." Chen emerged from her office, clipboard in hand, professional mask firmly in place. "Gentlemen, I assume you're here about our patient?" The older man stepped forward, his chest heavy with ribbons and insignia that spoke of a distinguished military career. Colonel Frank Morrison was exactly what Margaret had expected. Silver-haired, ramrod straight, with the kind of commanding presence that demanded respect. But something in his pale blue eyes made her skin crawl, a coldness that seemed to catalog everything in the room as either asset or threat. "Dr. Chen, I'm Colonel Morrison. This is Sergeant Martinez. We're here to collect military working dog Bella and transport her to appropriate facilities." His voice carried the absolute authority of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience. Margaret stepped forward, placing herself between Morrison and Bella's kennel. "Colonel, I'm Margaret Sullivan Hayes, the woman you spoke with earlier. I thought we agreed that the puppies weren't ready for transport." Morrison's gaze fixed on her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Up close, she could see the calculation behind his professional courtesy, the way his eyes moved from her face to Bella's kennel to the exits, mapping the tactical situation with military precision. "Mrs. Hayes, I appreciate your concern, but military protocol supersedes civilian veterinary recommendations. Bella is government property, and her disposition is not subject to negotiation." He turned to Dr. Chen. "Doctor, please prepare the animal for immediate transport." "Sir, with respect, those puppies are barely 2 weeks old. Separating them from their mother now could be fatal." Dr. Chen's voice carried professional authority that matched Morrison's military bearing. "As the attending veterinarian, I cannot recommend transport for at least another week." Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Doctor, Bella has specialized needs that require military veterinary facilities. Continued delay could compromise her psychological rehabilitation." Margaret watched this exchange with growing horror as she noticed Bella's escalating distress. The dog had begun pacing in tight circles within her kennel, her breathing rapid and shallow. Every few seconds, she would check on her puppies, then return to watching Morrison with the fixed intensity of prey watching a stalking predator. "Colonel Morrison," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest, "I notice that Bella seems particularly agitated by your presence, almost as if she recognizes you specifically." Morrison's pale eyes snapped to Margaret with laser focus. "Mrs. Hayes, Bella's behavioral issues include reactivity to authority figures. It's a common symptom of deployment trauma." "Is it?" Margaret stepped closer to Bella's kennel, noting how the dog immediately moved to her side of the enclosure as if seeking protection. "Because her reaction to you seems different from her response to other uniformed personnel. More personal, more afraid. What exactly are you implying?" Morrison's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Margaret felt the weight of truth pressing against her consciousness like a physical force. I'm wondering if Bella's behavioral issues might be related to something specific that happened to her while under your command. Sergeant Martinez shifted uncomfortably, his young face showing confusion about the undercurrents flowing between the adults. Dr. Chen had gone very still, her professional instincts clearly picking up on the threat level in the room. Morrison took a step toward Margaret, his military bearing shifting into something more predatory. Mrs. Hayes, I strongly advise you to be very careful about the accusations you're making. Bella suffered trauma during her deployments, but she was always treated with the highest standards of military care. Then why does she look at you like you're her worst nightmare? Margaret's question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. The silence stretched taut as Morrison's mask of professional courtesy began to crack. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones of barely controlled rage. That dog has been psychologically damaged by her service. Her perceptions are not reliable indicators of reality. She needs specialized treatment to overcome irrational fear responses. Margaret felt pieces clicking together with sickening clarity. Or maybe her fear responses are perfectly rational. Maybe she remembers something you'd prefer she forgot. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, a gesture so quick and automatic that Margaret almost missed it. But Bella didn't miss it. The German shepherd threw herself against the kennel door with such force that the metal rattled, her bark exploding through the clinic like a warning siren. "Sir!" Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, clearly alarmed by his superior's reaction. "Sir, maybe we should—" "Stand down, Sergeant!" Morrison's voice cut like a blade, but Margaret could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the clinic's comfortable temperature. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm going to ask you one final time to step aside and allow us to collect military property." Margaret looked at Bella, whose intelligent eyes held a desperate plea that transcended species barriers. The dog was trying to communicate something vital, something that Morrison clearly feared would be understood. "No," Margaret said simply. The word fell into the room with the weight of absolute decision. "I won't let you take her." Morrison's composure finally shattered completely. "Mrs. Hayes, you are interfering with official military business. I can have you arrested for obstruction." "Then arrest me," Margaret replied, her voice steady with the kind of courage that had sustained her through battlefield hospitals and military widow challenges. "But I won't stand aside while you terrorize an animal who's clearly been traumatized by her experiences under your command." Dr. Chen stepped forward, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Colonel Morrison, perhaps we could reach a compromise. Leave Bella and the puppies here for another week while we arrange appropriate—" "There will be no compromise!" Morrison's shout echoed through the clinic, causing Bella to redouble her frantic barking. "That dog comes with me now, or I'll have this entire facility investigated for harboring stolen military property." Margaret watched Morrison's loss of control with growing certainty that her instincts had been correct. This wasn't about a devoted handler retrieving his beloved working dog. This was about silencing a witness. "Bella isn't stolen property," she said quietly, her words cutting through Morrison's bluster like a scalpel. "She's a refugee. She escaped from something, and she's been trying to tell us what happened." Morrison's face went white, then flushed deep red. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Mrs. Hayes. Some sleeping dogs should be left to lie." "But they're not sleeping, are they, Colonel? They're having nightmares. And sometimes those nightmares contain memories that certain people would prefer stayed buried." The air in the clinic had become thick with tension so palpable it seemed to press against Margaret's skin. Morrison and she faced each other across a divide that represented more than simple disagreement. This was the collision between truth and cover-up, between justice and expedience. Sergeant Martinez looked increasingly uncomfortable, his gaze moving between his superior officer and the frantic German shepherd whose distress was impossible to ignore. "Sir, perhaps we should contact Base Command for guidance on how to proceed with civilian interference." "We're not contacting anyone," Morrison snapped. "This situation is contained, and it will remain contained." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. She'd heard those words before, in the careful euphemisms her husband had sometimes let slip about operations that never made it into official reports. Contained situations were military speak for problems that disappeared through unofficial channels. "Colonel Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in medical crisis management, "I think you should leave now. Come back with proper civilian court orders if you want to remove animals from this clinic." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating odds and angles with the precision of a career soldier. When he finally spoke, his words carried the chill of absolute menace. "Mrs. Hayes, I knew your husband. James was a good soldier who understood the importance of following orders and keeping secrets. I hope his widow possesses the same wisdom." He turned sharply toward the door, gesturing for Martinez to follow. "This isn't over. Bella comes home where she belongs, one way or another." As the military jeep pulled away, Margaret sank into a plastic chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Bella had finally stopped barking, but she remained pressed against the kennel door, her amber eyes fixed on the window as if expecting Morrison to return. Dr. Chen approached slowly, her professional calm clearly shaken. "Margaret, what just happened here?" "That man was talking about your husband like they had some kind of shared history." Margaret stared at her hands, noticing for the first time how badly they were shaking. "Sarah, I think my husband died keeping a secret that Bella knows. And I think Colonel Morrison just told us he's willing to kill to keep it buried." The clinic fell silent except for the soft sounds of the puppies nursing and Bella's anxious panting. Margaret realized that saving 6 newborn puppies had somehow led her to the doorstep of a truth that had been hidden for over 50 years, a truth that powerful men had killed to protect. And now she was the only thing standing between Bella and the people who wanted to make sure that truth stayed buried forever. That night, Margaret sat in her empty kitchen, staring at a shoebox filled with her husband's personal effects. Letters, photographs, and military documents she'd never had the courage to examine closely. The confrontation with Morrison had awakened something she'd kept buried for 3 years. A nagging sense that James's sudden heart attack at 64 had been too convenient, too final for a man who'd survived multiple deployments and decades of military stress. Bella lay at her feet, the German shepherd having refused to remain at the clinic after Morrison's visit. Dr. Chen had agreed to let Margaret foster the dog and puppies at home, understanding that separation would only increase Bella's trauma. The 6 puppies slept peacefully in a whelping box beside the kitchen table, but their mother maintained constant vigilance, her amber eyes tracking every shadow. Margaret pulled out a faded envelope marked March 1969, "Do not open until after my death," in James's careful handwriting. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal that had remained intact for over 50 years. The first document made her blood run cold. It was an incident report typed on military letterhead signed by Captain James Hayes and dated March 15, 1969. The subject line read, "Unauthorized engagement of civilian targets, My Lai adjacent operations." "Sweet Jesus," Margaret whispered, the words falling from her lips like a prayer for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. The report detailed a massacre that had never made headlines, never triggered investigations or war crimes trials. According to James's meticulous documentation, Lieutenant Frank Morrison had led a squad into a Cambodian village suspected of harboring enemy supplies. What they found were women, children, and elderly civilians trying to survive a war that had already claimed their sons and husbands. Morrison's orders had been clear. Eliminate all potential witnesses to American operations in neutral Cambodia. No survivors, no evidence, no international incident that could embarrass the military command. James's report described the systematic execution of 37 civilians, including 12 children under the age of 10. Margaret's nursing training helped her maintain clinical detachment as she read the horrific details, but her heart shattered with each carefully documented atrocity. James had been the unit medic, ordered to ensure that no wounded survived to tell their story. Instead, he'd secretly treated survivors and helped them escape into the jungle. The second document was a letter addressed to Margaret, written in James's hand, but dated only weeks before his death. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then Morrison has finally decided I'm too dangerous to leave alive. I should have spoken up 50 years ago, should have faced court-martial rather than live with this poison in my soul, but I was young and scared, and by the time I found my courage, too many people had careers built on keeping our secrets buried. Morrison has spent 5 decades destroying evidence and silencing witnesses. 3 of our unit members died in accidents during the 1990s when talk of war crimes tribunals was heating up. I pretended to play along, but I've been documenting everything, building a case for the day when the truth couldn't be buried anymore. Bella knows, Margaret. Military working dogs are trained to find things that people try to hide. I taught her to locate the evidence cache I buried near Morrison's property. If something happens to me, she'll be the only witness left who can lead investigators to the proof. Margaret's hands shook as she reached for the final document, a detailed map showing a location in the woods behind Morrison's Pine Ridge property. James had marked the spot with GPS coordinates and detailed landmarks, along with a note. Evidence buried 6 feet down in waterproof container. Includes photographs, witness statements, and Morrison's written orders for civilian executions. Bella lifted her head, sensing Margaret's distress, and patted over to rest her chin on the older woman's knee. The gesture of comfort from this remarkable animal who had been carrying such a terrible burden made Margaret's tears finally break free. "You've been trying to tell someone for 3 years, haven't you, girl?" Margaret whispered, stroking Bella's scarred ears. "You knew James was murdered, and you knew why." The phone rang, startling both women. Margaret's blood chilled when she recognized Morrison's voice. "Mrs. Hayes, I trust you've had time to reconsider your position regarding Bella." Margaret looked at the documents spread across her kitchen table, at the proof of Morrison's crimes and her husband's murder. "Actually, Colonel, I think we need to meet in person. There are some things we should discuss." "I'm glad you're seeing reason. I can be at your house in 20 minutes. "Not my house," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "The woods behind your property. There's something there that I think you've been looking for." The silence on Morrison's end confirmed everything she'd suspected. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to a deadly whisper. "Mrs. Hayes, I strongly advise you not to go anywhere near my property. Trespassing on military officers' land can have serious consequences." "More serious than covering up war crimes for 50 years?" Margaret asked quietly. "More serious than murdering a fellow veteran to keep him quiet?" Another long pause. "You have no idea what you're playing with, Margaret. Some secrets are buried for good reason." "The only good reason to bury evidence of murder is to protect murderers," Margaret replied, surprised by her own courage. "I'll be at the coordinates marked on James's map in 1 hour, Colonel. Come alone, and we'll settle this like the old soldiers we both are." She hung up before he could respond, then immediately dialed 911. "This is Margaret Sullivan Hayes at 847 Pine Valley Road. I need to report a planned confrontation with an armed and dangerous individual. I'm going to 42.3848 dg N 117.4234 degrees W in exactly 1 hour. If I don't call back by midnight, send everything to the FBI. Bella stood and walked to the kitchen door, her body language indicating she understood they were going back to the place where secrets had been buried too long. Margaret gathered the documents, sealed them in a plastic bag, and tucked them inside her jacket. "Come on, girl," she said, her voice steady with the kind of resolution that had sustained her through battlefield hospitals and lonely widowhood. "Let's go dig up the truth." The woods behind Morrison's property stretched into darkness like a mouth waiting to swallow secrets. Margaret's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the pine trees as she followed Bella deeper into the forest, guided by GPS coordinates that her husband had marked with the precision of a man who knew his life depended on accuracy. The German shepherd moved with purpose, her trained nose leading them along a path that seemed familiar despite the decades that had passed. Morrison was already waiting when they reached the designated coordinates. He stood beside a massive Douglas fir, his silhouette backlit by a powerful camping lantern that cast eerie shadows through the undergrowth. Margaret could see the bulge of a service weapon beneath his jacket, and her mouth went dry with the realization that she'd walked into a trap she might not survive. "Mrs. Hayes?" Morrison's voice carried across the small clearing with deceptive calm. "I was hoping you'd reconsider this foolish course of action." Margaret stepped into the circle of light, keeping Bella close to her side. The dog's hackles were raised, her amber eyes fixed on Morrison with the intensity of a predator recognizing a mortal threat. "Colonel, I think it's time we both stopped pretending this is about a lost dog." Morrison's weathered face remained impassive, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested barely controlled desperation. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Margaret. Some truths are too dangerous to unearth. More dangerous than letting a war criminal live in honor while his victims remain nameless." Margaret pulled the plastic bag containing James's documents from her jacket, holding it where Morrison could see. "I know what you did in Cambodia, Frank. I know about the village, about the civilians, about my husband's murder." The mask of military courtesy finally slipped completely. Morrison's hand moved to his weapon, though he didn't draw it yet. James couldn't leave well enough alone, always the idealist, always believing that truth was more important than survival. Margaret felt Bella tense beside her, the dog's trained senses picking up subtle changes in Morrison's posture that indicated escalating threat. "Survival? You call 50 years of hiding behind stolen honor survival? You think this was easy?" Morrison's voice cracked with genuine anguish. "You think I enjoyed carrying those memories? But James wanted to destroy everything. My career, my family's reputation, the lives of everyone who served under me. For what? To satisfy some abstract notion of justice for people who were already dead?" Margaret stared at this man who had terrorized her community for decades while hiding behind medals and ribbons earned through mass murder. Those people weren't abstractions, Frank. They were families. Children. Human beings who deserved to live. Morrison's laugh held no humor, only the bitter sound of a soul that had rotted from the inside. "In war, Margaret, survival trumps idealism every time. Those villagers were harboring enemy supplies, providing intelligence to forces that were killing American soldiers. I made a command decision to eliminate a threat. You murdered children, Frank. Babies who couldn't even walk yet." Margaret's voice shook with rage that had been building for 3 years. "And when James tried to stop you, you made sure he paid for his conscience with his life." Morrison drew his pistol, holding it low but ready. "James died of a heart attack. Natural causes, nothing suspicious about it. Just another aging veteran whose heart couldn't handle the stress of retirement." Margaret pulled out her cell phone, showing Morrison the screen. "I called the FBI before coming here, Frank. Everything is recorded." If I don't check in by midnight, they'll find James's evidence cache and learn the whole truth. Morrison's face went white in the lantern light. You're bluffing. If you had real evidence, you would have gone to the authorities instead of confronting me alone. I did go to the authorities, Margaret replied calmly. FBI agent Sarah Chen, yes, the same Chen who's been caring for Bella, is Dr. Chen's sister. She's been investigating suspicious deaths among Vietnam veterans for 2 years. Your pattern of silencing witnesses finally caught federal attention. The lie came easily, born from desperate necessity and sustained by Morrison's visible panic. Margaret had learned long ago that men like Morrison were most vulnerable when their carefully constructed worlds began crumbling. Morrison raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Margaret's chest. Then we have nothing left to discuss. You and that damn dog are going to disappear just like James did. Bella erupted into motion with the explosive power of a trained military asset. The German shepherd launched herself at Morrison's gun hand, 80 pounds of muscle and fury driving him backward into the Douglas fir. The pistol discharged into the canopy, the muzzle flash illuminating the forest in stark white light. Margaret dove behind a fallen log as Morrison struggled with Bella, his curses filling the night air as he fought to regain control of his weapon. The dog's training took over, using techniques designed to disarm hostile targets while avoiding lethal injury to herself. "Call her off!" Morrison screamed, his voice high with panic as Bella's jaws clamped down on his gun hand. "Call her off or I'll kill you both!" "Bella, release!" Margaret shouted, and the German shepherd immediately obeyed, backing away from Morrison while maintaining defensive position between him and Margaret. Morrison cradled his bleeding hand against his chest, his pistol lost somewhere in the undergrowth. His military bearing had crumbled into the desperate posture of a cornered animal. "You don't understand what you've done, Margaret. The people I protected, the careers built on keeping this quiet. They won't let you live to testify." Margaret emerged from behind the log, her flashlight trained on Morrison's face. "Then it's fortunate that I'm not the only witness anymore." The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the forest silence. Multiple engines, spotlight beams sweeping through the trees, voices calling official commands. Morrison's face went gray as he recognized the sounds of a federal law enforcement operation. "How?" he whispered, his voice broken. Margaret allowed herself a small smile of triumph. "Bella led me to James's evidence cache this afternoon, Frank. While you were threatening me at the clinic, I was photographing 50-year-old war crimes documentation and sending it to the FBI. The meeting tonight was never about confronting you. It was about getting your confession on record." She held up her phone, showing the active recording app that had been running since she'd entered the clearing. "Everything you just admitted is evidence now. The murder of civilians, James's death, your threats against me, all of it recorded and already uploaded to federal servers." Morrison sank to his knees in the pine needles, the weight of 5 decades finally crushing him. Those people were going to die anyway. The war was bigger than any of us. I was just following orders. "No, Frank," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of moral certainty. "You gave the orders? You chose murder over mercy, fear over courage. And you spent 50 years compounding that evil by silencing everyone who tried to do the right thing." The federal agents crashed through the undergrowth, weapons drawn, tactical lights blazing. Margaret raised her hands in surrender while Bella maintained protective position, her training keeping her alert, but non-threatening to law enforcement. "Margaret Sullivan Hayes," she called out. "I'm the informant who contacted Agent Rodriguez. The suspect is unarmed and wounded." As they placed Morrison in custody, reading him rights he'd denied to countless victims, Margaret felt a strange sense of completion. James's voice seemed to whisper in the wind moving through the pines, finally at peace after carrying the weight of terrible knowledge for half a century. Bella pressed against Margaret's legs, seeking comfort after the violence she'd been forced to inflict. The dog had spent 3 years trying to lead someone to the truth, carrying the burden of witness to atrocities that powerful men had killed to conceal. "It's over, girl," Margaret whispered, scratching behind Bella's scarred ears. "The secrets are out now. James can finally rest." In the distance, she could hear Morrison's voice growing faint as they led him toward the waiting vehicles, his protests about following orders and protecting national security falling on deaf ears that had heard too many similar excuses from too many war criminals. The truth had finally clawed its way out of the grave where Morrison had tried to bury it, and Margaret felt the first stirrings of hope that justice might actually be possible, even for crimes committed in the name of duty and honor. 6 months later, Margaret sat in the witness stand of a federal courthouse in Seattle, her hand resting on a Bible worn smooth by countless oaths. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of Morrison's victims, and veterans who had come to witness what many called the most significant war crimes trial in decades. At her feet, Bella lay in perfect attention, wearing a service vest that identified her as a certified therapy dog, a new role that had emerged from the ashes of her traumatic past. "Mrs. Hayes," the federal prosecutor began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "please tell the jury how you came to possess the evidence that led to Colonel Morrison's indictment." Margaret's voice was steady as she recounted the chain of events that had begun with 6 crying puppies and led to the exposure of a 50-year cover-up. She spoke about James's hidden documents, Morrison's threats, and Bella's role in leading investigators to the buried evidence cache. The German Shepherd's amber eyes tracked every movement in the courtroom, her training making her acutely aware of potential threats even in this controlled environment. Morrison sat at the defense table, his once proud military bearing reduced to the slumped posture of an old man facing the consequences of choices made half a century ago. His attorney had built a defense around following orders, the fog of war, and the impossibility of applying modern moral standards to combat decisions made in 1969. But the evidence James had so carefully preserved painted a picture of deliberate, systematic murder that no amount of legal maneuvering could obscure. The prosecution had presented photographs smuggled out of Cambodia by James, showing the aftermath of Morrison's tactical operation, 37 bodies, including 12 children, executed at close range with military precision. The images were too graphic for public display, but their impact on the jury was unmistakable in the silence that followed their presentation. "Mrs. Hayes," the defense attorney began during cross-examination, his tone respectful but probing, "you've testified that your husband carried this alleged evidence for over 50 years without reporting it through proper military channels. Don't you find it convenient that he chose to reveal this information only after his death?" Margaret felt a flash of the old anger, but her response was measured. "My husband was a military man who believed in honor and duty. He also believed in protecting the innocent. He documented Colonel Morrison's crimes not for personal gain but to ensure that someday justice would be served," the attorney pressed on. "But if these events truly occurred as you claim, why didn't Captain Hayes report them immediately? Why wait decades to come forward?" Margaret looked directly at Morrison, seeing past the frail old man to the young officer who had ordered the execution of children. Because he was young and scared, and he was told that keeping quiet was the patriotic thing to do. Because he believed the system would protect him if he played along. It took him years to realize that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is expose the truth about what was done in America's name. The trial had captivated national attention, sparking debates about the statute of limitations on war crimes, the responsibility of soldiers to disobey illegal orders, and the long shadow that Vietnam continued to cast over American society. Veterans groups were divided. some supporting Morrison as a soldier who had done his duty under impossible circumstances, others demanding accountability for actions that violated every principle of military honor. Margaret had received hundreds of letters during the trial, some thanking her for her courage, others condemning her as a traitor who was dishonoring her husband's service. The hate mail had been particularly vicious, with anonymous callers threatening her life and vandalizing her property, but the support had been equally powerful. Fellow military spouses who understood the courage required to challenge authority, veterans who had carried their own secrets of wartime atrocities, young people who saw her as a symbol of moral courage in the face of institutional power. Dr. Sarah Chen had testified about Bella's condition when she was found, documenting the physical and psychological evidence of prolonged abuse. The veterinarian's expert testimony had established that Bella's fear responses were consistent with severe trauma, not the behavioral issues that Morrison had claimed. More significantly, she had described how Bella's specialized training had made her uniquely capable of locating buried evidence, a skill that had been weaponized against her handler when James taught her to find the cache that would eventually expose Morrison's crimes. The most powerful testimony had come from Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen, a Cambodian-American physician whose family had fled the region in 1970. Dr. Nguyen had spent years documenting American military actions in neutral Cambodia, and she was able to place Morrison's massacre within the broader context of unauthorized cross-border operations that had claimed thousands of civilian lives. The victims in these photographs, Dr. Nguyen had testified, were not enemy combatants. They were rice farmers, children, elderly people who posed no military threat. Their execution was not a regrettable casualty of war. It was a war crime, plain and simple. As the trial neared its conclusion, Margaret reflected on how profoundly her life had changed since that September morning when she'd found Bella and her puppies. The empty house that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the sounds of 6 growing German Shepherd puppies who had been trained as therapy dogs for veterans suffering from PTSD. The financial struggles that had forced her to choose between medication and heating bills had been alleviated by donations from supporters across the country who had been inspired by her story. More importantly, she had found purpose again. The Margaret Hayes Foundation for Military Truth and Reconciliation had been established with funding from private donors who believed that accountability for wartime atrocities should not be limited by time or rank. The foundation provided support for whistleblowers, funded investigations into historical war crimes, and offered counseling services for veterans struggling with moral injury from their service. Bella had become the foundation's unofficial mascot, her story serving as a powerful symbol of loyalty, courage, and the importance of bearing witness to truth. The German Shepherd had been featured on magazine covers, given interviews on national television, and received commendations from veterans organizations across the country. But Margaret knew that for Bella, the greatest reward was simply having a safe home where her protective instincts were valued rather than feared. The jury returned their verdict after 3 days of deliberation. Guilty on all counts of war crimes, murder, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a verdict that sparked both celebration and controversy. At 82 years old, his actual prison time would likely be measured in months rather than years, but the symbolic importance of his conviction resonated far beyond the courtroom. As Margaret left the courthouse with Bella at her side, she was surrounded by reporters shouting questions about justice, closure, and whether the conviction would bring peace to the families of Morrison's victims. She paused on the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd of supporters and protesters who had gathered to witness this moment of historical reckoning. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," she said simply, her words carrying across the plaza with quiet authority. "The truth has finally been told." and that's all my husband ever wanted." Bella pressed against her legs, seeking comfort after hours in the tense courtroom environment. Margaret scratched behind the dog's scarred ears, grateful for the loyalty of this remarkable animal who had carried such a terrible burden for so long. Together, they walked toward their car, ready to return home to the 6 puppies who were being trained to help other veterans heal from the wounds of war. The truth had finally set them all free. As Margaret settled into her favorite armchair that evening, Bella curled at her feet, and the 6 grown puppies scattered throughout the living room that had once felt cavernously empty. She reflected on the profound transformation that had begun with a simple act of compassion. The house that had echoed with the hollow silence of grief now resonated with the gentle sounds of contentment. Soft breathing, the occasional thump of a tail against furniture, the reassuring presence of creatures who had chosen to make this their forever home. The foundation had grown beyond anything Margaret had imagined possible. What began as a desire to honor James's memory had evolved into a national organization that provided support for military whistleblowers, funded investigations into historical war crimes, and offered specialized therapy programs for veterans struggling with moral injury. The 6 German Shepherds, all certified therapy dogs now, worked with veterans across the Pacific Northwest, their gentle presence helping heal wounds that traditional medicine often couldn't reach. Margaret's mailbox, once filled only with bills and medical appointment reminders, now overflowed with letters from veterans who had found the courage to speak their own truths, military spouses who had discovered purpose in advocacy work, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by the story of a lonely widow who chose conscience over comfort. The financial struggles that had once forced her to choose between medication and groceries had been replaced by the comfortable security that came from purpose-driven work and community support. But the greatest transformation had been internal. The woman who had awakened each morning to the oppressive weight of purposelessness now rose with the eager anticipation that came from meaningful work. Her calendar, once empty except for medical appointments and solitary walks, was filled with speaking engagements, foundation meetings, and therapy sessions with veterans who needed to understand that healing was possible even after the worst moral injuries. Dr. Chen had become more than a veterinarian. She had evolved into a dear friend and collaborator, helping to establish the Foundation's animal therapy programs and serving on its board of directors. The professional relationship that had begun with emergency care for abandoned puppies had blossomed into a partnership that was changing how the military community approached PTSD treatment and moral injury recovery. The legal victory over Morrison had resonated far beyond a single courtroom. Congressional hearings had been launched into historical war crimes cover-ups, military accountability procedures had been strengthened, and veteran advocacy groups had gained powerful new tools for protecting whistleblowers. Most importantly, the conviction had sent a clear message that age and decorated service records could not shield war criminals from the consequences of their actions. Margaret had received a Presidential Citizen's Medal for her courage in exposing the truth about Morrison's crimes, but the ceremony had felt less significant than the quiet moments when a veteran would approach her after a speaking engagement to say that her story had given them permission to forgive themselves for surviving when others didn't, or to seek help for trauma they had carried in silence for decades. Bella had become something of a celebrity. Her story featured in documentaries about military working dogs and the lasting bonds between humans and animals who served together. But Margaret knew that fame meant nothing to the German Shepherd compared to the security of knowing she would never again be abandoned, never again forced to choose between survival and loyalty. The puppies, now fully grown and magnificent in their own right, had each found their calling in therapy work. Rex worked with combat veterans at the VA hospital, his calm presence helping men and women process the guilt and anger that often accompanied invisible wounds. Luna specialized in working with military families, teaching children how to cope when parents deployed or returned, changed by their service. Thor had become the Foundation's official greeter, his gentle nature making him perfect for working with visitors who were taking their first tentative steps toward healing. Each dog carried forward Bella's legacy of loyalty and service, but in ways that healed rather than revealed terrible secrets. They had transformed the trauma inherited from their mother into a force for good, proof that even the darkest experiences could be alchemized into something beautiful and redemptive. Margaret's relationship with her own children had deepened as well. The distance that had grown between them after James's death had been bridged by their admiration for her courage and their pride in her transformation from grieving widow to national advocate. Her grandchildren, once strangers who visited only on holidays, now spent summers at the Foundation, learning about justice, compassion, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The Pine Valley neighborhood had been transformed by the Foundation's presence. The empty houses that had once symbolized Margaret's isolation were now filled with veterans and their families who had come to Spokane specifically to participate in the Foundation's programs. The community that had once felt like a place where old soldiers went to fade away had become a beacon of hope for those seeking healing and purpose in the aftermath of military service. As Margaret prepared for bed, following the evening routine that had evolved to include checking on each of the dogs and ensuring that Bella's arthritis medication was properly administered, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life lived in service to something greater than herself. The loneliness that had once consumed her had been replaced by the richness that came from being needed, valued, and surrounded by creatures who had chosen to trust her with their vulnerable hearts. Bella approached her chair, moving more slowly now, but with the same dignified bearing that had first caught Margaret's attention on that September morning that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. The German Shepherd placed her graying muzzle on Margaret's knee, amber eyes still bright with intelligence but now softened by the peace that came from knowing her terrible burden had finally been shared. "We did good, didn't we, girl?" Margaret whispered, stroking the dog's ears with the gentle touch of someone who understood that love was best expressed through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. Bella's tail moved once in response, and Margaret felt the profound contentment that came from knowing that neither of them would ever be alone again. They had found each other in the darkest moments of their lives, and had chosen to transform their shared trauma into a force that helped others heal. The secrets that had once threatened to destroy them had become the foundation for building something beautiful and lasting. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of changing seasons and new beginnings. Inside, a woman and her chosen family of rescued dogs settled into the comfortable rhythms of a life built on truth, loyalty, and the revolutionary idea that it's never too late to find your purpose or create the family your heart needs most. Message for American seniors. Your life's most meaningful chapter might be waiting to begin right now. Margaret Hayes thought her story was over at 67. A lonely widow facing financial struggles in an empty house, feeling forgotten by a world that had moved on without her. But when she found Bella, a traumatized German Shepherd protecting 6 helpless puppies, everything changed. That single act of compassion didn't just save 7 lives. It uncovered a decades-old conspiracy, brought justice to war crime victims, and transformed Margaret into a national advocate who built a foundation that continues healing veterans across the country. At an age when society expects you to slow down, Margaret discovered that her decades of experience as a military wife and nurse had perfectly prepared her for her most important mission. Her empty house became a haven for therapy dogs, her isolation transformed into purpose-driven community leadership, and her financial worries disappeared as she found work that mattered. Sometimes, the most profound adventures begin when we think we're too old for new chapters. Your wisdom, compassion, and life experience aren't signs that your story is ending. They're exactly the tools the world needs right now. Engagement. Questions. What moment in your life made you realize you still had more to give than you thought? If you could use your life experience to solve one problem in your community, what would it be? Share your story in the comments. Your next chapter might inspire someone else to find theirs.